Welcome to all of you. Many thanks for joining this webinar, including for some of you at a very early or very late time in the day. It's been very difficult to find a time that would suit everybody. But we will record this webinar and distribute it globally, so whoever misses it will be able to catch up with it. I'm Anne Grandjean. I'm in the Human Rights Unit in Program Division. I'm actually based in Geneva, where I am the liaison between UNICEF and all the human rights mechanisms. I'm here in Geneva with Mr. Gianni Magazzini, who is the chief of the UPR branch at OHCHR. We're very honored to have you with us, Gianni. Together with me is also Beatrice Dano, who is working for PPD and working with me on the UPR, and Christina Kroeter from PFP. And as you'll hear later in the webinar, we have 3 colleagues from country offices joining us in this call: Vijaya from Vietnam, Elspeth from North Macedonia, and Marie Consolé and Mary from Benin. And thank you to all of the participants and to all of the speakers for taking part in this webinar. In terms of the agenda, you've received it. Unfortunately, Vidya, the Deputy Director of Program, could not be with us, so I'll do some of the introduction. Then it will be Gianni explaining exactly what is the UPR, how does it work. I'll then take the floor again to explain our own engagement within UNICEF. And then the 3 country offices that I've mentioned will take us through their own experiences, the lessons learned, and what they got out of it. Then we'll go into Q&A, and hopefully all of you will be able to ask questions, and we'll give you the answers and see how we can work on this together. So I thought that maybe the first thing to cover is that would be to give a little bit of context to place the UPR into context, which is of course a reminder to all of you, but to place the UPR within the whole galaxy of accountability mechanisms. And on the concept of accountability itself, I know it's obvious for all of us, but I think it was useful to remind it that accountability is really a core dimension of the human rights approach, and that without accountability, rights are only empty promises. And I think it's even more important to remind us of this this year, which is the 30th anniversary of the CRC. That in 1889 introduced a concept that was revolutionary at the time and that still is to some extent today, meaning that children are rights holders as opposed to subjects of adults' goodwill and charity, and that because they are subject of rights, this calls for accountability to hold states and perpetrators of violations accountable. So that's why this concept is so central to our approach. There are various mechanisms holding states accountable at different levels, national, like the courts or the NHRIs, for example, at the regional level as well, and at the international level, again, being the courts or being the human rights mechanisms. All of these mechanisms have very different features, obviously. They're all complementary, all have strengths and weaknesses, and each play a very distinct role towards the same end, which is, again, to enforce human rights and to hold perpetrators of violations to account. So the human rights mechanisms are, again, many and complementary. And altogether they form a solid, or as solid as can be, system to monitor human rights, including child rights globally. So there are the treaty bodies, which are, as you know, are 10 bodies currently that monitor the implementation of the core international human rights treaties, including the CRC. There is the Human Rights Council, that is the main intergovernmental forum discussing human rights globally, with 47 members that meet 10 weeks a year in Geneva, and they're in session now. They monitor human rights and set standards through a number of thematic and country resolutions. There are also the special procedures. There are currently 44, if I'm correct, thematic and 12 country mandate holders who are independent human rights experts who report on advice on human rights from a thematic or a country-specific perspective. They conduct country visits and produce recommendations. There are also the commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions and investigations that are set up to respond to situations of serious human rights violations, like in Syria, South Sudan, Burundi, OPT, Myanmar, and others. And the topic of our discussion today, the UPR. So I won't go into details in any of this because that's not, except the UPR, we'll go into details now, but not of the others. But if you are interested at some point to have deeper discussions on any of this, you can say so in the comment box, and we'll be happy to organize other webinars on these other mechanisms at a later stage. So that was for the context to set the stage of where the UPR fits within this whole galaxy. And I'm now going to turn to Gianni so that he can explain in details what the UPR is about and how it works.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss how the UPR can actually assist all of you to deliver more results for children's rights at country level. I also want to start by recognizing the exemplary engagement for children's rights by UNICEF staff worldwide since the Convention on the Right of the Child. So that's a long way back. And I would like to start exactly by asking the question, what's the UPR and how it compares to something like the CRC, which you have known and engaged with quite well for so long? Well, the primary difference is that the UPR is a peer review mechanism, member states to member states, advised, however, by the UN system, civil society, national human rights institutions. And it comprises three main elements, which are the three reports that guides the discussion of the UPR: the national report, the compilation report, and the summary of stakeholders, which includes, indeed, regional human rights mechanism, national human rights institution, and civil society organization. So my key message to all of you is the more you provide input for every single country that comes for the review, the more we can reflect your concern in the UN compilation. And that could be often as a joint submission by the country team or by the individual agency program submission from the field or from HQ. That is always very welcome, and that is a tool that will allow the member states to see what are the concerns and use those to make specific recommendation to the state under review. Similarly, you can engage with the stakeholders at country level to alert them on what are the main issues of concern to you, and they similarly, in their submission, can highlight those concerns so that they can be reflected in these two documents, which are not very long and summarize often hundreds of submissions made by multiple stakeholders. If I have to characterize to you this third cycle of the UPR, which lasts 4.5 years, so we are at the beginning, or actually almost in the middle of this third cycle, I would say to you a few things. First, there is 100% participation by member states so far. So no one member state has failed to come and participate in the review from the very beginning, when it all started with the Human Rights Council. In the context of the third cycle, which started in May 2017, the averages of participation of member states in the reviews is about 100, with an average of 2.34 recommendations per state, which tells you that every state under review receive about 200 and more recommendations. Importantly, the delegations of this state under review in the working group, as well as often for the adoption, comprise many members, not only of the government, but also state entities and other important institutions such as the prison, the police, and other administration. and they are often aided by one or more ministers. So there is a very strong political commitment by member states, which has been reiterated even a few days ago in the high-level segment of the 40th session of the Human Rights Council. Member states take the UPR very seriously. So, taking all of this into account, what are the tools that we consider you can use to maximize the impact at country level? Well, from the beginning of the third cycle, the High Commissioner has started sending to every single foreign minister of the country that has gone through the working group and the adoption in the Human Rights Council a letter which contains three main elements. Strengthen your national coordination mechanism for human rights promotion and protection, of course taking into account all what you have received and especially what you, in a sovereign manner, have accepted in terms of those recommendations. 2, make an action plan or a list of priorities between now and the next cycle of the UPR 4.5 years later. And 3, align your human rights efforts with the Agenda 2030, with the development efforts, and try to integrate as much as possible your work on human rights with each and every one of the 17 SDGs. This is a very important element which was reiterated in the Council by the Deputy Secretary General just yesterday. We had a high-level dialogue with her on the SDGs and human rights, and she made a very important point. The UPR is a very good entry point. Again, because member states own it, because member states make commitment in terms of implementation of all kinds of recommendations covering all kinds of rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, in front of their peers, and therefore those are a very good entry point, an open door for engagement at the country level. Another thing that we are devising to facilitate the task at the country level to unpack the UPR and make good use of it for your own planning and programming or for your UNDEF is that we are providing, and we will place this just like the letter of the High Commissioner on our website, a matrix which will in a clustered way indicate all the recommendations that have been accepted by the states and that are within a certain category, like gender, rule of law, ratification, child's rights, education, and so on and so forth. And we hope that this will facilitate for you the possibility of using those specific recommendations that have been accepted. And I emphasize the accepted with the indication that for us, the High Commissioner, but also the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General, there is a view that this accepted recommendation needs to be taken into account as the entry point, which can then, of course, go beyond into treaty bodies, special procedures, and all the other mechanisms that Anne has referred to, including recommendations of Commission of Inquiry, fact-finding, and additional such element. But clearly, what the member states has accepted of what they receive from member states is a different category. And it's one that is proving to be very helpful when it comes to implementation and follow-up at the country level. And in that sense, and I see here the slides which is before you, this indication from our Universal Human Rights Index, which is a database of all recommendations for all countries, where you can click on the SDGs and have those recommendations from all the mechanisms unpacked, SDG 1 to 17. Here you have an example which has been generated for a specific country, and if I don't recall wrongly, this is exactly China, so that you can see what are the recommendations that fall within specific SDGs, in addition to having those clustered indication of accepted recommendation that again should be able to facilitate you the use of this mechanism in order to achieve maximum results at country level. Now, when I refer to the national mechanism for coordination and follow-up, and if we can go back to that slides, one thing that it's critically important, and more member states are actually utilizing this recommendation to strengthen their capacity to coordinate through the Attorney General's office, the Minister of Justice, or other ministries, the work that needs to be done on human rights. Of course, at country level, the coordination goes next to consultation with multiple stakeholders, often with the UN system, different agencies, often under the leadership of DRC or individually, but also civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and clearly in the recent past we have seen more and more of an engagement also of parliaments and parliamentary human rights committee when it comes to the promotion and protection of human rights and their role in follow-up to recommendations that require legislative action, that requires action by the parliament. So all of this to say, the UPR is a very useful mechanism. It will be much more focused and helpful when it comes to the action at country level. The more your engagement starts from the very beginning, the preparation of those reports we have referred to earlier, which member states use for making recommendations, and then, of course, sharing your good practices or challenges, and, of course, being involved in implementation and follow-up at country level, hands in hands with the relevant ministries and the authorities concerned, using what they have accepted as an entry point for action and not as the end of the story when it comes to ensuring the accountability that Anne referred to and ensuring that SDGs and all human rights go hand in hand together to ensure and deliver rights for everyone so that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gianni. If that's okay for everybody, if there is no burning question at this stage, I just suggest to move ahead and to unpack a little bit what is our suggested engagement as UNICEF. But please, if you have questions of clarification, do not hesitate to write them in the comment box so that we can take notes of them. So, in terms of our own engagement in UNICEF, and starting with why do we think that stepping up this engagement is important, of course, are all the reasons that Gianni has just mentioned. The issue of strengthening accountability also that I mentioned at the beginning. But just to recap on some of the points made by Gianni, so it's a way to hold states accountable. It's universal. So it reviews the human rights record of all UN member states, regardless of what treaties they have ratified or not. And that's, for example, of particular interest to us in terms of the US, for example. It exerts a very positive peer pressure that we can see translated into strong commitment from states. And here are some statistics of demonstrating that commitment. For example, the fact that in the second cycle, 73% of the recommendations were accepted by the states under review. That in the first cycle, 74% of the recommendations were partly or fully implemented. And also, as mentioned, that at the Human Rights Council during the plenary, there is usually a very high level representation from states, usually at the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, representation that shows that they do take this process seriously. Then we think that we do, as UNICEF, have very interesting opportunities to engage and influence, and this is what we're gonna tell you more about with the country offices examples that are following. And all of this together, we believe that it's a very useful way for us to trigger more results at the country level, more results for children. So, as I said, at the end of last year, we stepped up our engagement. And as a first step in that process, we have analyzed all the recommendations that were made in the second cycle and classified all of them against each right of the CRC, just to understand what type of child rights issues were being discussed. By the way, children's rights is the third most raised issue, as you can see here in this slide. It amounts to 18% of all the recommendations made in the second cycle. Just to give you also an absolute number, in the second cycle there were 6,641 recommendations. And maybe we did not explain what the cycles are, but basically one cycle is the review of all states. So now we're in the third cycle, which means that all states of the world are being reviewed for the third time. So when we did this analysis, we could conclude, one, that the 5 most raised issues within child rights were protection against violence, non-discrimination, the right to education, protection of rights in general, which covers general recommendations, but also the general measures of implementation under Article 4 of the CRC, and then right to health. So this, and here on the slides, I don't know if you see it big enough, but basically you have the absolute numbers of those recommendations made. What our analysis also told us is that the 5 states that made most recommendations on child rights in the second cycle were Slovenia, Portugal, Mexico, Uruguay, and Italy. We're now doing that same analysis for the third cycle, and this top 5 ranking is changing, so that's not absolute, but this gives us a good idea of who are the potential allies for us when we do advocate in this context. So we're using this, and then in the slide as well, you do have a breakdown of which states do support the particular issues. So taking protection of violence, you see that Italy, Slovenia, and Canada were the states making most recommendations in this respect. So we have that tool, and basically we use it to determine which state is likely to support which topic in the UPR process, and that helps us to approach the right state with the right issue. And now I'm going to explain more exactly how we do that. So in terms of our engagement and how we worked with Vietnam and North Macedonia at the end of last year is the following way. The sentences in, just a remark, if everybody could mute their microphones because there is some noise. Thank you. The bullet points in blue are what the country offices are doing, and the bullet points in green are what us in Geneva are doing. And when it's in both colors, is what we're doing together. So it really shows that it's a teamwork. So as Jenny was mentioning, basically country offices can contribute to the UNCT report, both by focusing on the status of implementation of the previous recommendations, the recommendations made in the previous cycle, and flagging emerging issues that were not mentioned at the time, but that have emerged in the meantime. It's also possible for country offices to do separate reports. The UNCT reports are constrained by a word limit, so if there are issues that do not make it in the UNCT report, you always have the opportunity to do your own separate report. Then later in the process, and this is what we've done together with Vietnam and North Macedonia, is to identify 3 key policy recommendations that you'd like states to put forward when they make recommendations to the state under review. Here, the recommendation is that these 3 key policy recommendations be, of course, evidence-based, and the actual evidence needs to be submitted with the recommendation, and also to pick actions that are in your annual work plan or will be, but that you know that you will be able to support. That's a very important selling point when we do approach the missions with it, because they want to know that whatever they recommend will be implemented. Then we use the database and the analysis that I presented right in the slide before to identify which states are likely to support your policy recommendation. So if one of them is on violence, then with our table, we're able to see which states are likely to make recommendations on violence. So we do approach those states here in Geneva with the very specific recommendation that we want them to make. And at the country level, country offices collect do the same with the embassies of the same country. And we do this obviously in a coordinated manner. And then after that, we hope that the state that we've approached are making these recommendations. In the experience we had so far, and colleagues from Vietnam and North Macedonia will confirm, but for Vietnam, there was one recommendation that was made by one state, and for Macedonia, there were 4. So we could see that it worked. Once the recommendations are made, then another important role for the country office is to advocate with the government for the government to accept as many of them as possible. Because as Gianni mentioned, the states have the opportunity to either accept or only note the recommendation. And when they do accept, it's obviously a very, very strong hook for us to advocate and program at the country level. Then another step is that we in Geneva do a statement when the UPR outcome document is adopted at the Human Rights Council. In this statement, we praise the government for having accepted some recommendations. We regret maybe that some others were not accepted, and we offer our support for implementation. Then, of course, a very important step is the implementation itself, and the country officers supporting the state in implementing these UPR recommendations in country. And I'm kind of rushing because I know I still don't have much time. And then, yes, more generally, there's also something that we're doing at the moment, or about to start doing, is that you might know the PPP manual is being reviewed in New York. And so we are trying to integrate into it more guidance on how to implement the UPR recommendations also in our programs. So you're going to receive this as well. Okay, so that's it from my side. If you have questions, do not hesitate to put them in the comment box. In the meantime, we'll give the floor. Oh, and here, sorry, is one more slide that shows all the countries that are going through the UPR this year in 2019. Every year there are 42 states, 3 times 14 states being reviewed. And here you see the list. The list is also in the invitation for this webinar that you've received. And if you're not sure, you can also always approach us to know if your country is up for review soon. Yeah, so now I think we can go to the country example. Vijaya, do you want to go ahead?
Hi there.
Hello?
Anne, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great,
Yes.
great. Okay, hi everyone. This is Vijay from Vietnam, and as Anne has shared with you, we worked with the Geneva office on Vietnam's 3rd cycle appearance in the UPR. There's 3 areas that I wanted to talk about from our experience. Firstly, using the UPR to draw attention to children's rights violations in Vietnam. It was a very helpful process to be involved in, to identify critical children's rights issues that could benefit, as Gianni mentioned, from recommendation of peers, i.e. other member states. And we use the evidence from our program, from our engaging in other human rights processes within the UN, also with bilateral donors, to kind of identify what were critical children's rights issues that we wanted to raise. It aligned very much with our program and the concerns in country. So, for example, issue that Vietnam is focusing on is the definition of the age of a child, which excludes 16 and 17-year-olds and leads to some gaps in terms of the protection of rights of children in that age group. And the other issue that we highlighted was around violence against children, which also aligned very much with an upswing in attention to this issue within the country amongst the public. So as Anne had mentioned, I think that there was benefit to using, aligning the issues that we wanted to advocate on with our program and also what was happening in the country. The next issue is about the experience, the different tools that we use, which I mentioned briefly, different dialogues, UN Human Rights Treaty Body reports and special procedures. Vietnam last year submitted its State Party report on the CRC, as well as on the CRPD and CEDAW. So there was a lot of understanding and a lot of attention to various human rights issues in country and across the different UN agencies. So we drew on all of that existing information. We also conducted some analyses, as Anne has talked about and Gianni talked about. So looking at the previous cycle of recommendations on children, who made those recommendations, and whether or not the government of Vietnam had accepted those recommendations was the starting point of our analysis. And then we also, as an office, then looked at those different recommendations from the previous cycle and gave our opinion about whether they had the degree of implementation. So the recommendations that the government had accepted, how far had they implemented those recommendations? This is an internal analysis that we conducted, and also very much based it on evidence that we had at hand, and particularly drawing on the evidence that we had been generating over the last couple of years of our program cycle. So that those two exercises that we did internally also occurred at the same time as we were inputting into the UNCT report on Vietnam's UPR. So what we were aiming to do was to try and ensure that there was a healthy reflection of the children's rights issues in Vietnam in that UNCT report, and using the evidence that we had generated and also our own analyses to input into that UPR report. Around that time, it coincided well with the support provided by our team in Geneva, who then were also doing an analysis, and part of it is what Anne has showed you earlier around what states had made recommendations on children's rights for Vietnam, the recommendations by sector, what are the top recommendations. So all of that information we were able to then use to also be plotting out how we were going to approach different member states shortly about this next cycle, and also what we were putting into the UNCT report. Following the UNCT report, we did an analysis of it as well to look at how the recommendations coming from UNCT Vietnam stacked up again for children's rights, and also did an analysis about whether the recommendations were directly, indirectly, or not related to UNICEF's mandate. So that was a very useful exercise as well. And what we found in the end was that over 50% of the recommendations made by the UNCT in Vietnam were directly relevant to UNICEF's mandate and to children's rights. So we thought that that was a good outcome for the UNCT report. And then all of that then coalesced at the same time into what we saw were the emerging issues in Vietnam. And across the office, we identified 7. We went through an internal discussion process to narrow those down to 3 key issues that we then worked with the Geneva team and Beatrice to, as you see, I think in the slide, to kind of put into a one-pager that is of our 3 recommendations, what we're asking for, and the evidence base for it, so that when that information was taken to permanent missions in Geneva, they had it at hand, that these are the 3 key recommendations UNICEF is advocating for, and here is the evidence to support those recommendations. We also then used that here in country to go and visit the different embassies that we agreed we would attend. In terms of lessons, because of time, a couple of things that I would highlight from our experience. The government of Vietnam, as many of your governments as well, are highly sensitive to human rights issues and to the UPR process, and also particularly what the UN says about Vietnam and human rights in public forum. So they, and this is something I think it's very useful for country officers to really sit down and talk about and do a bit of an analysis internally of the political economy, of looking at what will this process achieve? Will it or will it not achieve what you want it to achieve? And really think about who is the audience that is going to be seeing these documents. So as has been mentioned, the UNCT report in this case and other reports are compiled into the consolidated UN information, and that is made public. It is published on the OHCHR website. And it's, I think one of the things that we learned is that looking at the way that UNICEF tends to work with governments in partnership across the world, and the experience that we've had with the human rights treaty body reporting processes and special procedures, where those mechanisms are, our inputs are confidential, and the idea is to be very frank with those bodies, and they potentially can say things that we maybe cannot say directly, whereas this UPR process is slightly different. So really, as a country office, looking at that and being very considerate about whether you are able to achieve what you want to achieve around the recommendations through other means, or whether this UPR process is a way to achieve those issues. The other thing is that also considering the UNCT report and participation in that UNCT report, because it's different agencies, all the agencies in the UN. Some agencies may have different, maybe more strident in their views or how they express things that may or may not align with the way that UNICEF has operated or operates in countries. So always taking that into consideration. I think the other thing that I think was a great lesson learned was UN coordination in country. It's a great opportunity to bring all the agencies around the table to see who is doing what and coordinate, collaborate, piggyback on different agencies who are doing different things. Whether it's training with civil society organizations, whether it's training for development partners or briefings or trainings with the government, all of these different opportunities definitely are something to be taken into account. I'll stop there and hand back to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Vijay. That was very comprehensive and interesting. I'm now giving the floor to Elspeth in North Macedonia to share also for the next 10 minutes the experience of North Macedonia. Elspeth?
Thank you so much, Anne, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for asking us to share our experience in this process. I think it's been a very interesting one for our team. Let me start out by saying that it's been with great appreciation of the Geneva team that we've been able to, I think, have a moderate success in what we've been able to achieve through the process. I'm going to start by a little bit of internal learning that we did in the process. And that's this first slide, which looks a little bit wild, I think on purpose, because I think we found that it was a great learning process for our team going through this. Of course, we are very aware, all of us as UNICEF staff persons, of the human rights mechanisms and the importance of this process for our work. But very often, as practitioners in the field, I think we feel that we focus a lot on the immediate. We're always running ahead, and we focus on what immediate programming we're doing. And so it's been very interesting to see the relinkage for our team of these immediate, urgent implementation advocacy areas and the wider advocacy field that's been offered to us in this UPR process. Much like the colleagues in Vietnam, we started by looking at all of the recommendations. So the base of this slide here is looking at some of our highlighting of some of the issues that had been raised and identification of all of the child rights related recommendations that have been made in the previous round, and then our attempt to link them together with current issues. And we went through quite a process of doing that, digging through the previous issues, seeing what remained relevant, and being positively impressed by the way that a lot of the recommendations had been taken into account, that a lot of things were in process. We are, as a side note, in a moment of significant forward momentum in areas of collaboration and momentum for children's rights here in this context. So it was a very positive thing to see so many of the things that we highlighted in yellow in that first pass through are actually things that are ongoing. I'll also say as a side note, we didn't actually contribute to a collective UNCT report in our context. So part of our learning was within our agency and with, of course, Geneva's help, moving forward to see how to distill the work going on and the recommendations we wanted to make into something that was very much focused on the advocacy in Geneva and locally with partners. That was the focus of our work. So we started and put together a first round of recommendations, highlighting the current advocacy issues that really related to our work and related to the previous recommendations. And I would say we did that probably in a much more traditional way than we needed to, looking at the kind of things that we were advocating in our day-to-day. And I think, as we'll see on the next slide, what resulted were recommendations that turned out to be very much like our usual advocacy. It's not bad. As we heard earlier, it's important to know that UNICEF is working towards these issues, but a lot of the recommendations in this first draft round had phrases like continue to work on this or step up efforts towards this in areas where consensus had already been reached. And though there's still work to do, there was significant positive momentum already in these areas. And so we realized quickly in reanalyzing these first draft recommendations that we came up with in September, October, that perhaps we were losing an opportunity to advocate at a different level. And so we did a quick revision and revisited and refined what we were looking at. And what we did, and again, it's highlighted in the next quick slide, We revisited focusing not only the gaps that were currently being closed and where positive momentum was ongoing, but we relooked at areas that were perhaps emerging areas of rights gap, ongoing rights areas, areas where, although they were important for UNICEF and for partners, perhaps we weren't quite working yet and there wasn't that forward momentum. For example, from the initial recommendations, we identified in our first draft things like disability inclusion, ECD, things that are very important but were easy wins. And on that second thought, we moved forward to areas where there isn't yet a broad national consensus achieved, things like poverty and exclusion, children in detention and disenfranchisement of youth, areas that are sharper, areas that are bigger gaps, and areas where we could take advantage of the process that we were going through, which was not the formal mechanism, but the going to missions to advocate for them to take messages forward. And so allowing governments as peers to say things in a different way that we as UNICEF can. Ultimately, it led us to be stronger in our recommendations, perhaps less cautious than we would be if it was UNICEF's voice moving forward, but also being able to build that evidence base and that fact base towards not only identifying the issues, but finding solutions. And we also felt that it was possible to do something in a way that UNICEF doesn't always do. Very often as UNICEF, we want to go into discussions like this with a solution in hand. But in one or two of the recommendations we made, and we made a total of 5 in this, I'm sorry, yes, 5, I'm looking at the wrong sheet, in our final submission for discussion. A couple of the issues we didn't have ready solutions. We felt that it was all right to flag the issues, to put ourselves forward as being willing and keen to work on them, but hoping for the ideal of gathering a consensus together to work for the solutions. And the result of all of this allowed us to advocate both in Geneva, with thanks to the Geneva team, but also locally. And as we already heard, several recommendations that we had put together were in fact shared during the session, and there was a direct reflection of some of the work we had done locally and some of the messaging that we'd done locally in recommendations that were actually put forward in the session. So what did we learn from all of this? Well, again, as a small country office, we enjoy the convergence of what we've done through this process and what we're continuing to do in order to promote our wider advocacy issues over long term. I think first we learned that the advocacy that we do on a regular basis outside of the moments of opportunity for discussion in a UPR cycle or other moments of touching upon the human rights mechanisms, all of that contributes towards the opportunity then to leverage UNICEF's voice and credibility in moments such as this, when we want to send stronger messages or different messages, or allow there to be a furthering of some of the work that we want to see happening in the future. We were able to have both formal and informal discussions at the local level with several partners and donors and countries who ultimately made recommendations. And part of the reason that we were able to have those is really because of the groundwork of networking and the trust that they shared with us, that they had in us in order to put forward ideas. And that's what we're going to be moving forward with, I think, as we go on to our further advocacy beyond this moment. So looking forward, we'll continue to push in all of the areas of recommendation, both of the ones that we raised initially, where we have ongoing traction, but also in these new areas where we were able to highlight more greater gaps, perhaps, in rights issues. And continue to build on that strong credibility with trust we have with the partners, but also with the government. it really does segue very nicely into our ongoing advocacy work and partnership on child rights issues, and will, I think, ultimately lead to stronger success, both in the government's attempt to achieve success against these recommendations, but also in the wider programming and advocacy that we're doing as a country program. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. I think these lessons really will help us also fine-tune our own approach in the future. Now we're going to turn to Benin. Just to say that both North Macedonia and Vietnam are still in the process. Now they're both at the stage where states the government has to take a decision on whether to accept or not the recommendations made. So we're still halfway in the process. However, Benin has completed the process, so we thought it was important to also hear an experience on how to implement the recommendations once accepted by the government. So Marie Consolée, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for giving us the floor and opportunity for us to also learn. I think I've learned so much from Vietnam and Macedonia. We have such different realities, you know. In fact, for the case of Benin, the UPR process is led by UNDP. And the synergy, it might not be as excellent as Vietnam under the One UN approach, but we work very hard to make sure that they hear us at the UNDP, and we coordinate our efforts to support the government, but also the civil society. So in fact, the process is over, and the government was represented by the Minister of Justice, so at a very, very high level, last November 2017. There were a total of 200 recommendations. Out of the 274 regarded children, out of the 200, the government accepted 192. And out of the 74 that concerned children, they accepted 71. And they rejected 8. 3 were concerning children. I'm just giving you this background so that you understand that quite an important number of the recommendations are concerning children. So we are responsible and mandated to follow up with the government. Vietnam was highlighting some of the issues that, you know, come out of the recommendation, and for us, some of the recommendations that are important and we are following with the government relate to violence against children. 15 of the recommendations were on those issues related to VAC, and 11 concerned child marriage and ritual killings. I'll come back to that very quickly. Other recommendation, 19 related to treaties, laws, policy, national plans, and then some concerns about the condition of detention, where children in Benin are also victims of this detention, child trafficking. What actually was concerning for us, what some of the recommendations were related to ritual killings and children that are locked up in voodoo convents. And then the third one that they rejected was concerning the percentage of the rate of violence against children, which is a result of the mixed data, so which was developed with the government, endorsed by the government. So these 3 recommendations also rejected are the ones that we are following in the country. We are supporting Franciscan Benin to push forward the agenda and to protect children that are victims. I don't know if you hear me well.
Very well.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sorry. And it's a situation because the government is in total denial of the situation of children that are victims of ritual killings up north. So in this perspective, we have actually use the UPR again as a very important tool, like other colleagues, to analyze and assess the different child rights violations in the country. But we also used it to look at the emerging issues around child rights in Benin, and lobbied and promoted dialogue with a very strong support from our head of office, the representative, to go to the government, to galvanize the civil society, to support the civil society on those recommendations and how we can actually draw up a plan of action to address the recommendation. A good practice that we have now implemented in the country is to take some of the recommendation and actually translate them into core activities in our AWP, in our annual work plan in support of government agenda. So we discussed with the government what would be the recommendation we could take forward, and this has really helped us to address key issues, in particular in relation to some of the recommendations that the government should be implementing on the ground. I think that the other issue that we really think is a winning entry is the work in collaboration with the broader UN system, particularly UNDP and UNFPA. I think the other colleagues mentioned it, for us to look at how we can better advocate with as a force towards the government to actually take their responsibility. So working together to see what we can do, analyzing the recommendations and coming out with an action plan. The other entry point that was really very instrumental over the past years and year is the work within the Justice and Technical Gender Working Group. As an entry point to also use those instances to push forward the implementation of the recommendation, particularly for the justice system, but beyond, and use the chef de file to actually do also an advocacy towards the government with all the different elements of analysis. We also have been working very, very strongly with the civil society. In fact, we have established a specific partnership with CLOSE, which is the largest national NGO network on child rights. And they have a very specific mandate to actually take some of the recommendation and lobby around it using community radios and the media to speak up for the children's rights, undertaking the critical issues forward, and organizing debates and discussions around those core elements and those issues. So the civil society and the youth have been really great platforms, and we're working on a very systematic way to push forward the agenda. In fact, this morning we are hosting #NotMe discussion with the young people from over 40 NGOs on the ground, and the discussion is around ending child marriage. What is the engagement of boys, of course, and girls, but particularly the #campaign initiative is to see the role of men and boys in addressing the issue of child marriage, which is also one of the recommendations of the UPR. So moving forward, I would summarize saying that we are using the EPR as a tool for assessing child rights violation, key area, emerging area. We've used it also to look at how we address issues in the EST Time, how we also prepare our new country program, which is starting now. And we used it also to build and consolidate some of our advocacy and ongoing discussion with the government partners, but also with the bilaterals, on how to improve the situation of children in Benin. Lesson learned, I know we don't have much time, I have 1 minute. I think for our context, we have a serious issue with the denial around certain realities, specifically those realities related to witchcrafting, children accused of witchcraft, We have data that estimate around 10% of children being born up north could be subject to ritual killing. So it's very serious. But at the end of the day, what we realize now is that the government is also very sensitive about its image internationally. So they are reactive to being out there and, talk about what they are doing, but not so much to recognize some of the realities and issues that concern children. We talked about strong partnership, which is also a very important element of a lesson learned for us to have a stronger advocacy, and then the coordination among the UN agencies. My last point would be on moving forward, of course, continuing and reinforcing our advocacy and prioritization of the issues that have been highlighted in the UPR. But I think, for me, the reflection goes around what mechanism can we put in place for more accountability by state parties, particularly to follow up on the recommendation. We find ourselves regularly being the one to push the government to look at the recommendation, come with action plan, and push forward. So I would stop here by saying what pressure mechanism can really be effective to make sure the government actually take responsibility and take action, allocate enough money, enough budget to some key ministries like the social ministries. And I will stop here because I know time is money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie Consolée, and really to the three of you. I think you gave a great overview of the various ways to leverage the UPR. Now we're going to move into the Q&A. So you're all invited to type your questions in the boxes, and we will handle them. And while you do so, I'll just turn to Gianni, who could maybe take up your last question.
Yes,
Marie Consolée. Yeah,
thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to all of you for those very concrete and very valuable experiences. And coming to the point raised in the context of Benin, I think that the letter that the High Commissioner has written to the Foreign Minister for Benin is already available. It's on our website explicitly because we hope that that can be a tool for advocacy by many, not just the UN system, and with respect to child-related issues, UNICEF, but also the parliaments, civil society organizations, other entities. We have put it in the open, so to say, so that this UPR is an opportunity to reflect on what the High Commissioner broadly consider as priorities over the next 4.5 years, and moves away from government that comes with a very senior delegation to Geneva, and then they go home and think, well, the work is done. Well, the High Commissioner letter that comes a few weeks later, and it's public, is just a reminder the work is just now to start, so that you can prepare well for the next cycle of the UPR, in the case of Benin, 4.5 years after 2017, so by 2022. One other advocacy tool is to press Benin to do what the High Commissioner in the letter also mentioned is important, namely midterm reporting. It is a voluntary commitment on the part of member states, but 72 countries are already doing that. And one country, the UK, is doing yearly updates. So encouraging them to do a midterm reporting means another opportunity for the government to meet together with their ministries, state entities, NHRI, civil society, often facilitated by or encouraged by the UN country team or UNICEF when it comes to child's rights, and take stock of where we are so that they can be proud of what they've been able to accomplish after 2 years of the commitments they made back in 2017, and also take a stock of what still needs to be done before it becomes too late, because for the 4th cycle of Benin, things will warm up very soon with a national report due, in not so many years coming up. So it's about 2 more years. one more point, if I may, Anne, that I wanted to reflect on what has been said so far. Yes, in the past, especially in the second cycle, recommendations have been rather generic. And someone mentioned continue to do something which you find not very helpful and maybe even behind the realities on the ground. So the third cycle has been a little bit more focused on precise, time-bound, smart recommendations. And you will see that in most cases, it's even going down to the article of the penal code or procedural code that needs to be modified, or laws that needs to be repealed, or components of practices that needs to be adjusted so to be in line with international human rights standards. Well, how do we do that when it comes to child's rights? I think that's where your input in the compilation becomes so critically important. And while we receive quite a few joint submissions through the RC and by the UN country team, we would encourage you to consider submission as UNICEF as well, in addition to or complementary, because we feel that you have a level of expertise and knowledge that can then allow not so much our report, but member states reading those reports to just target what they consider critical so as to improve laws, practices, and implementing regulation, manuals, whatever it takes to improve on enhancing the promotion and protection of child's rights at the country level. Those were a few considerations I wanted to do, plus one, if I may. We have the opportunity also to have member states doing advanced questions. And Anne probably knows all about that and may unpack that for you further down the line. But those advanced recommendations is an opportunity also to encourage that the recommending state, especially if it is an OECD DAC member, makes a recommendations in an area that they deem of priority also for their ODA, and then if that recommendation is accepted, that delivers also through the UN, in this case through UNICEF, more funding for activities that may require also the engagement of UNICEF itself when it comes to facilitating the follow-up and implementation by the member states of something that they've accepted. So this notion of looking at preparing well for the UPR discussion, taking also into account the donor community on the ground, their willingness to take on board some of the key recommendations, and then the fact that they could follow up with ODA support to the UN entity that would be first and having the mandate to follow up and support implementation is something that I also would like to flag at this stage. Over to you, Anne.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gianni, for these clarifications. In the meantime, we had a question from Carlos Ravir that is addressed to colleagues in Benin, Marie Consolé and Marie. And the question is, what are the criteria to select some specific recommendations to be operationalized into the rolling work plans? So Marie Consolé, maybe you can... Yeah, how you...
Yes, it's an excellent question, Carlos. Hola. It's been quite innovative in the sense that we were looking at ways to support the government to actually comply with the recommendations. And often the government would say, we really don't have the means. We have the will, but we don't have the means. So because we identify the priorities of area of support on a yearly basis with the government, we looked at, in line with the priority that have been identified, or in line with the ongoing national priorities that we push forward in terms of the agenda for children, what are some of the recommendations we could support as UNICEF through the annual work plan that they sign as the government, the Ministry of, we work with 4 ministries, the Ministry of Social Affairs, Justice, Interior, and Labor. And so we identify the recommendation based on, well, the urgency of the matter, but also based on the priorities that have been set, aligned with the country program, but also aligned with the needs of children. So, for example, if we look at maybe other recommendation from the CRC committee on the report on the implementation of the Convention of the Right of the Child, one of them, for example, was about providing evidence on the situation of children that are involved in prostitution and child pornography. The government said, we know the situation is happening in the country. It's a serious child rights violation, but we really don't have the means to conduct a study to look into the issue. So we took that opportunity to say, okay, we can work with you to draw up the terms of reference and then hire consultants and we can walk the walk together and come out with a study which is today our advocacy tool. To actually take action. So from that study, we now have evidence of over 3,000 child prostitution sites in Benin. And so we took that recommendation from the study to say to the government, okay, we could support the police, Brigade des Mœurs. How do you say Brigade des Mœurs? It's a special unit in the police that looks at moral behavior issues, to support them to actually look at inspections and what they can do in some formal settings where we know that children are being drawn to prostitution. So this is a concrete way to say that we can also align it with our priority, with government priorities, and include them in our key interventions in the work plan. I don't know if Mary wants to add something.
No, I think Mary, you said everything. It's also the scale of the violations is also important. We try to push that forward and try to bring the government to accept that and then support them also in that area. So where big numbers of children are suffering, we also, in the report, we also try to support that area. Make sure the government take that into account. We want to support the biggest number of children possible, and those already in critical situations.
Over from us.
Thank you very much. Then there was a next question about, again, for the 3 countries, so maybe we can turn now to either Vijaya or Elspeth, about how did you engage at the subnational level, if at all? Does one of you want to take that? Or otherwise?
This is Elspeth. I'll just say that in our context, we didn't engage at the subnational level, although I think it would be very interesting to do so. In our context, because we're an extremely small country, we look at issues at the national level. So all of the advocacy issues that we raised really has that national perspective. Over.
Yeah, thank you. Vijay?
If I may.
Yes.
I don't know if I may just very quickly. We work at upstream and downstream level, specifically because a lot of child rights violations are happening up north, and we have a very decentralized government. So, for example, we have taken the opportunity of the recommendations to accelerate some of our activities around the dissemination of the Children's Act. With the civil society on the ground, with the government, departmental level, and working around those tools to actually raise awareness on the ground level in local languages about the child rights, of course, but also some of these kind of recommendations that are crucial for also ensuring that at the ground level, the administrative local authorities also take action in their action plan at the commune level. Yeah. We've, just to say, flag out that we have worked with the religious leaders over the past 2 years, but last year they have signed a charter of engagement of the religious leader to end child marriage. And it's been a lot of dialogues and putting forward the key recommendations around the issue of child marriage, but it's starting to pick up.
Zai, do you want to add something?
Just to add from Vietnam experience, so this time around, we didn't get to go as far as we wanted to with subnational engagement. In the case of Vietnam, we have an office in Ho Chi Minh City. The main office is in Hanoi, the capital, and our Ho Chi Minh City office focuses primarily on partnerships, particularly private sector. So we had done an analysis around, focused in on recommendations on business and human rights and children's rights and business principles. And a lot of the work happens in Ho Chi Minh City at the subnational level because that's the financial economic center of Vietnam. And in the process of prioritizing what would be the key recommendations we would advocate for, children's rights and business principles didn't make the cut. So we didn't pursue that much further. And there was a lot of interest, absolutely, and engagement at that Ho Chi Minh City level with private sector and also embassies who have a big focus on private sector and trade as well, and their consulates are down there. So that's something that we can take up maybe going forward.
Excellent, thank you, Vijay. So I think that answers that question. Then there was a question from Germany that was asking basically about the roles of the NATCOMs in this process. So we're lucky to have here Christina from PFP who can answer that question. And just to specify that we checked in the meantime, and Germany is up for review in 2023, if we're correct. Christina?
Hello. So I'm Christina from PFP, and we are supporting the NATCOMs in their UPR engagement, such as Anne and Beatrice do for their country offices. So of course you have exactly the same opportunities as the country offices as well. And right now, for example, we support Slovenia to develop their key recommendations, which we then will distribute together with the help of Anne and Beatrice among the permanent missions, so that those key recommendations will be incorporated in their recommendations to the state. And for example, we also have another example from Belgium, who submitted a joint NGO statement together with 5 other NGOs. And the UK, for example, submitted a report to the OHCHR, which was also incorporated into the recommendations of 78 states. And yeah, for Germany, as your review was last year in 2018, we could, for example, now together see which are good entry points to advocate, so that you can advocate your state to implement the recommendations made. So just contact us and then we can follow up bilaterally. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I can add something, Anne, yes, indeed, they went through the 3rd cycle of the UPR last year. Like in the case of Benin, the letter of the High Commissioner to the Foreign Minister of Germany, it's up on our website. Please look at it, because it can be a good advocacy tool. It's not just the letter which provides some generic recommendation. There is also the annex which contains those areas that the High Commissioner believes Germany should give particular attention over the next 4.5 years prior to the next cycle in 2023. And key partners for a NETCOM could be certainly the Parliament, the National Human Rights Institution. Beate Rudolph is actually the head of the NHRI in Germany and happens to be also, up to now, the chair of GANRI, which is the Global Alliance. The parliaments, the head of delegations of Germany 3rd cycle was headed by an MP. So I think that those are all tools that will reinforce the level of support for action on the part of the government and various state entities, together as well with the Council of Europe, of which Germany is a member, and who has provided us with a number of important elements in the summary report, together with FRA, which is also quite active on specific rights-related issues. So I think that those are important entry points, not just in Germany, but countries of the global north, as was mentioned, the UK, Netherlands, Finland, they've all gone through the third cycle. High Commissioner's letters and those matrices of what they've accepted and what can fall within also the interest of UNICEF as well as other UN entities active in the global north will be available for you on our website as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. There was also a question on whether there is data on the level of implementation of the child rights recommendations so far. So obviously that's a bit of a complex exercise to be carried out because we need to get information country by country and what do we mean by implementation, and typically we would need information from you if we were to gather that at some point. But the UPR Info, which is an NGO who is very engaged in this in the UPR and supporting NGOs to engage, has done such an analysis for the first cycle, if I'm correct. And their conclusions in the first cycle were that 74% of all recommendations were either partly or fully implemented. And I don't think they looked at child rights recommendation in particular, but they might have that information. We'll check with them. Yeah, so I guess the answer is that we do not have any ready-made information so far, but maybe in the future that would be interesting for us to look into it with your support. And then there was a question, or maybe rather a comment on why is it that human rights issues seems to be considered as the unique responsibility of child protection colleagues. As I mean, I've worked in child protection in UNICEF all my career until I moved last year to the Human Rights Unit. And so your remark, Camila, is extremely true, and I think this is my one of my daily struggles. And we are trying to fix that through several ways. One is that we always encourage that all the treaty body reporting is being led by the deputy representative at country level and not by the child protection unit. So as to make sure that all the other sectors are also engaged. We're also trying to make a child rights training mandatory for all staff as part of the onboarding. As you may know, we do have human rights focal point in each of the regional offices, because for us as the human rights unit, we do not have natural counterparts at the country level, but we do work through the regional offices to reach out to all of you. And so far, most of these human rights focal points in regional offices are actually the child protection advisors. So we are trying to change that and to move that function to the deputy regional directors instead. This is happening in some region and not in all yet. So yes, those are the initiatives that we are taking to try to change that. But I fully agree with you. The reality still is that it falls on child protection often, and that it shouldn't be the case, and that it, like all staff, should be involved in all of this. Yes, Vijay, do you want to say something?
Sorry, just to share, to toot our horn in Vietnam a little bit. So my background is in child protection, and although the designation according to UNICEF is child protection specialist, my title in the office is children's rights and legal advisor, and I actually sit in the social policy and governance team. And under our new country program, we really raised the issue of children's rights across the entire country program to ensure that it is an issue, that it is across all programs, that it's not located in just one section. And I think that's something that, with this work that Anne is talking about, we hopefully will see more across different country offices.
Anne,
Yes.
this is Elspeth again. Could I just jump in on this too?
Yes.
Taking advantage of the fact that I'm one of the three presenters that does not have a specific child protection experience, but it's not really related to that I wanted to speak. I think our experience was one in which we came together as a multi-sectoral team to analyze things, partly because we were doing the exercise very much within UNICEF. But then I think our experience was reinforced through the process of advocacy that followed, where different issues were appropriate to be carried forward by different sectors. And in the particular donor advocacy that we felt was a very positive experience in our particular context, where one or two of the key donors, one in particular, carried literally our specific recommendations and research forward into the UPR session. I think we had reinforced in that it is very much a multi-sectoral approach that we need to take. And also in the carry-through of the recommendations that came out, it will be definitely a multi-sectoral approach. So while there is an analytical perspective where child protection and or social protection have perhaps a stronger initial background, in order to carry forward in the planning in the future cycle and in the advocacy and collective action that we see is going to be necessary in order to implement recommendations that have been made, we feel very strongly that it is a multi-sectoral approach that we'll succeed in. Hopefully, we can carry that forward effectively. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Elspeth. Agreed. Yes, go ahead, Jenny. Yeah.
Thank you, and just had a few more comments, listening very carefully. We had an indication from 70 NGOs that for the third cycle, it would be important to start assessing implementation. And of course, as you said, it's very difficult to be done. Now, the two things I want to mention here is one, that the letter of the High Commissioner with the unpacking and making it all available online is an effort in that direction to create a baseline so that multiple actors at very senior level are aware where we are in 2018 or 19 and therefore can plan well. But then, of course, the input that will come, especially as we go into the fourth cycle, from the various agencies, NHRIs and NGOs, with a sense of what has been done or not done, could be very helpful. The second point I wanted to mention is that UNFPA has done an assessment in the context of sexual and reproductive health and rights for the second cycle. I think that that could be perhaps something to keep in mind, because of course, even for us, it would be a very important element to take into account if there were to be an assessment made by the specific entities responsible for particular rights. And then finally, something that I would encourage you to consider, sharing of good practices. We have heard how important it is to share how it has been done, what have been the challenges, but also the opportunities for achieving concrete results. And we would certainly encourage you to do that in the context of the general debate under item 6 in Geneva, but also regionally or sub-regionally in the context of workshop. We are trying to do that as well. We have started actually in Africa last year, and we are planning to do a similar exercise for member states primarily, but together with the country team next in Asia Pacific, and China is actually considering that possibility to be a host. We will also look at other options if that will not work out in the middle of this year, and then also in the Americans afterwards. But that an encouragement to share more of what is happening, because it can be extremely valuable for those countries and colleagues that are coming up next year or in the coming years.
Yes. On that one, on the good practices, as many of you know already, we engaged in such an exercise last year, trying to document what was the impact, measurable impact on children of all our human rights mechanisms engagement with the treaty bodies, with the UPR, with the special procedures. We were very ambitious in wanting to demonstrate not only the link on changes in the system, meaning a new law or a new institution, but also then in turn, real measurable changes for children. like an increase in the education rate for girls, or like a decrease in detention, and that was actually very difficult, a very difficult exercise to carry out. We were ambitious and wanted some 10 examples, and we probably will have only 2 or 3 in the end that do show that whole continuum. I don't think that means that there is no impact. I'm convinced that there is an impact, but making the link is difficult. Colleagues were overcautious in not wanting to attribute any changes on the engagement, although it was very clear that we're not talking of attribution, but really just of a contribution among many other interventions. So we are not giving up, but that was, in the end, we had to change a little bit the exercise and more have a documentation of what works and doesn't work, but we didn't manage to really have good practices. Now, the good news is that the evaluation office in New York is actually interested in trying again with more funds and maybe more rigor in the methodology. And so that's something we're discussing at the moment, and we might have that soon. And in the meantime, we will share this what works and doesn't work analysis with everybody when it's ready, which should be in a couple of months. And unless there is any burning issue, I think this brings us to the end of the webinar. Just maybe a quick reaction to Elena's comment, Elena from Bulgaria comment about a good practice of having child rights monitoring specialists in some offices. Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, it's not the rule yet. I know also of some regional offices starting to recruit child rights specialists, like in MENA. So hopefully that's maybe a new trend. Let's see. Is there any last burning question or comment? If not, we will close. As mentioned already, we will share the recording of this webinar with all of you, and also beyond all of you to all staff. We will also share the PowerPoint presentation. And we are all available if there is any follow-up question. If you'd like to discuss with us bilaterally, never hesitate. Thank you again to the 3 country offices who have accepted to share their experiences. Many thanks to Gianni Magazzini for coming to us and sharing his experiences with us, Christina from PFP. And that's it. I see there are some last comment. Yeah. So I guess that's it. So all the best to all of you. Have a good, well-deserved weekend. Bye-bye.